Dr. Sarah Chan pulled the cardboard box from the shelf and dust exploded into the air. The archive basement of the Chicago Historical Society smelled like old paper and secrets. She'd been cataloging Victorian-era photographs for 3 months. And this was the last uncategorized box. Inside were cabinet cards from the 1870s. Formal portraits, mostly. Families in stiff poses. Children with blank expressions. Nothing unusual. Then she found it. A photograph of a man standing next to a doorway. The man was at least 9 feet tall. Maybe 10. He wore a formal suit. Hands clasped in front of him. His face was calm, unremarkable. Behind him stood 3 normal-sized people who barely reached his chest. Sarah turned the photograph over. No label, no date, no explanation. She examined the image under her magnifying glass. The grain was consistent throughout. The shadows fell correctly. The proportions were impossible, but the photograph wasn't manipulated. She'd seen enough faked images to know the difference. This was real. She pulled out her phone and searched the archive database. Nothing. The photograph didn't exist in any catalog. Someone had filed it away and forgotten it. Or hidden it. Sarah looked closer at the doorway behind the giant. It was massive, easily 12 feet tall. She'd seen doorways like that before, in old government buildings, courthouses, administrative centers built in the 1800s. Everyone assumed they were built for grandeur, for intimidation. But what if they were built for function? What if they were built for him? Sarah spent the next week searching other archives. The Boston Public Library had 1, the New York Historical Society had 3, the Smithsonian Archives mentioned 5 in a catalog from 1923, but claimed they were lost. Every photograph showed the same thing. Impossibly tall people. 8 feet. 9 feet, sometimes more, standing in formal poses, wearing normal clothes, surrounded by normal-sized people who didn't look shocked or amazed. They looked ordinary, like this was normal. The photographs clustered between 1850 and 1895. After that, nothing. The giants simply disappeared from the photographic record. Sarah made a spreadsheet, dates, locations, physical descriptions. A pattern emerged. Most of the giants appeared in photographs taken near government buildings, construction sites or administrative offices. Many wore uniforms or formal attire, suggesting official positions. One photograph showed a giant standing in front of a courthouse in Philadelphia. The building had doors 15 feet high. Sarah found architectural plans from 1867. The plans showed those doors clearly, but offered no explanation for their size. Another photograph showed 3 giants standing with a crew of normal-sized workers at a construction site. The caption on the back read, "Railway Oversight Committee, 1874. The giants weren't workers, they were overseers. Sarah's hands shook as she added entries to her spreadsheet. This wasn't random genetic abnormality. This was systematic, organized. These people had roles, positions, authority. Then she found the furniture. The auction house in Vermont specialized in estate sales. Their online catalog showed a Victorian-era chair listed as oversized decorative piece. The seat was 3 feet off the ground. The back stretched 7 feet high. Sarah drove 6 hours to see it in person. The auctioneer, a man named Robert, led her to the warehouse. Came from an old government building in Burlington, built in 1872. They're renovating, selling off the original furniture. Sarah sat in a normal chair, then stood next to the giant one. The seat came up to her waist. No normal person could use this chair comfortably, but someone 9 feet tall. "You get a lot of furniture like this?" she asked. Robert shrugged. "More than you'd think. Usually gets labeled as curiosity pieces. Rich people in the 1800s had weird tastes, I guess. Where else? Government buildings, mostly. Some private estates. There's a desk in storage from a courthouse in Maine. Seat height is almost 4 feet. Who builds a desk you can't sit at?" "Someone taller," Sarah said quietly. Robert laughed. "You're not one of those giant people conspiracy theorists, are you?" Sarah didn't answer. She bought the chair for $300. Back home, she measured everything. Seat height, 34 inches. Armrest height, 42 inches. Back height, 86 inches. She calculated the proportions. This chair was designed for someone approximately 9 feet tall with proportionally longer legs and torso. She searched auction records. Dozens of similar pieces had sold over the past decade. Chairs, desks, bed frames, all oversized. All from buildings constructed between 1850 and 1900. All dismissed as decorative oddities. But decorative furniture doesn't show wear patterns. And this chair showed decades of use. Someone had sat in it regularly. Someone it actually fit. Sarah expanded her research. If giants existed in the 1800s, newspapers would have mentioned them. She started with the New York Times archive. 1885, skeleton of unusual proportions found in Michigan Mound, measuring 7 feet in length. 1887, railway workers discovered giant human remains near Cleveland. Bones suggest individual over 8 feet tall. 1891, excavation in Wisconsin reveals burial site containing remains of extraordinary size. The articles were matter of fact, no sensationalism, no speculation, just reporting giant skeletons found, measured, sent to the Smithsonian for study. Sarah found similar reports in the Chicago Tribune, the Boston Globe, the San Francisco Chronicle. Between 1880 and 1920, hundreds of discoveries. Most skeletons measured 7 to 10 feet. Many were found in organized burial sites with artifacts suggesting advanced metallurgy. Then, after 1920, the report stopped. Not gradually. Abruptly, Sarah called the Smithsonian. She identified herself as a researcher and asked about the giant skeleton collection. "We don't have any giant skeletons," the archivist told her, "but the newspapers from the 1880s say specimens were sent to you. Those records are incomplete. Many items were lost during facility transfers in the early 1900s. All of them. Historical record-keeping wasn't as rigorous then. Things get misplaced. Hundreds of skeletons. All misplaced." Sarah didn't believe in coincidences that convenient. Sarah started measuring buildings. She drove to courthouses, government offices, and administrative centers built between 1850. In Boston, a courthouse built in 1873 had interior doors 12 feet high, not the grand entrance. Those were expected to be large. The doors in back hallways, service corridors, rooms where grandeur served no purpose. In Philadelphia, an administrative building from 1881 had staircases with risers 10 inches high. Sarah had to stretch to climb them comfortably. They weren't designed for normal human proportions. In Chicago, a government office from 1869 had a waiting room with chairs identical to the one she'd bought. 3 of them. Original to the building. Perfectly preserved. She interviewed architects and historians. Everyone had the same explanation. Victorian access. Intimidation design. Aesthetic preference for grand proportions. But none of them could explain why buildings designed to intimidate the public had oversized furniture in private offices. Why working corridors had impractical dimensions. Why the extra cost and construction difficulty made sense. Unless the people working there weren't normal-sized. Sarah photographed everything. Door heights, stair dimensions, ceiling clearances, furniture measurements. She created a database comparing these buildings to modern government offices. The differences were stark and consistent. Buildings from 1850–1900 average door height 12 to 15 feet. Average ceiling height 18 to 20 feet. Average desk height 40 to 48 inches. Modern buildings average door height 7 feet. Average ceiling height 9 to 10 feet. Average desk height 29 to 30 inches. The old buildings weren't just taller, they were proportionally scaled to different human dimensions. Everything was 40–50% larger, exactly what you'd expect if the occupants were 40–50% taller. Sarah's research led her to old maps. She was tracking the locations where giant photographs and skeleton discoveries clustered. Many were in the American Midwest, but others were scattered across Europe and Asia. That's when she noticed Tartaria. On maps from 1700 to 1850, Tartaria appeared as a massive territory spanning northern Asia. Not a small region, a major geographical designation covering millions of square miles. Encyclopedia entries described it matter-of-factly. Atlases labeled it clearly, then it vanished. Maps from 1860 onward showed the same territory divided into Russian holdings, Chinese regions, and various smaller states. Tartaria itself disappeared. No explanation, no historical account of its dissolution, just gone. Sarah found an 1855 encyclopedia with a full entry on Tartaria. She found an 1865 edition of the same encyclopedia. The entry was deleted. Not updated, deleted entirely. She searched academic databases for papers on Tartaria. Almost nothing. A few brief mentions in historical geography texts. Always dismissive. A vague term for an undefined region. Cartographic convention rather than political reality. Never any detail. Never any investigation. But the architecture in those regions told a different story. Government buildings in Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and southern Russia, all built in the 1700s and 1800s, showed the same oversized proportions as American buildings from the same period. Massive doors, huge staircases, furniture scaled for giants. Sarah found photographs from Russian archives. Giants in formal military uniforms. Giants standing with normal-sized officials. Giants at construction sites overseeing workers. The photographs dated from 1860 to 1890, the exact period when Tartaria disappeared from maps. The exact period when American newspapers reported giant skeleton discoveries. The pattern was too consistent to ignore. Sarah spent 3 sleepless nights assembling her findings, photographs, measurements, newspaper clippings, maps. She laid everything out in her apartment, creating a timeline on her wall. A theory emerged, uncomfortable, impossible, but fitting every piece of evidence. What if giants weren't anomalies? What if they were a specialized class? What if they served as guardians, overseers, administrators of a civilization we'd been taught never existed? It would explain the photographs, why giants always appeared in formal, official contexts, why they wore uniforms and stood with authority figures, why they were photographed at construction sites and government buildings. It would explain the architecture. Buildings weren't oversized for aesthetic reasons. They were functional spaces designed for the people who worked there. Giants needed those dimensions the same way normal people need standard height doors and chairs. It would explain the systematic erasure. If you're inheriting infrastructure you didn't build, inheriting administrative systems you don't fully understand, what do? You adapt, you rewrite the history, you claim it as your own, and you remove evidence of who built it originally. Sarah thought about the missing skeletons. Hundreds of specimens, all sent to the Smithsonian, all lost during transfers. The timing aligned perfectly with the disappearance of Tartaria from maps, with the end of newspaper reports about giant discoveries, with the last photographs of living giants. Someone had made a decision. Certain questions were no longer acceptable to ask. Certain evidence was no longer acceptable to preserve. But they couldn't erase the buildings, couldn't erase the furniture, couldn't track down every photograph hidden in private archives. The evidence persisted, fragmentary, scattered, but there. Sarah submitted a paper to the Journal of American History. Architectural evidence for non-standard human proportions in 19th century administrative buildings. It was rejected within a week. While your measurements are thorough, your conclusions are speculative and unsupported by mainstream historical evidence. We recommend focusing on documented architectural trends rather than anomalous explanations. She submitted to the Journal of Architectural History. Same result. The Victorian period is well known for grandiose design preferences. Attributing oversized proportions to biological factors rather than aesthetic choices is not supported by architectural scholarship. She tried anthropology journals, historical societies, archaeology publications. Every rejection used similar language. Interesting but not significant. Speculative. unsupported by mainstream consensus. No one engaged with her evidence. No one addressed the photographs, the furniture, the newspaper reports, the measurements. They simply dismissed the conclusion and moved on. Sarah contacted museum curators. Most didn't respond. One wrote back, "We're aware of the photographs you mention. They're classified as medical curiosities, gigantism cases, not relevant to broader historical narratives." "But there are dozens of them," Sarah replied, "across multiple countries and decades. How is that not relevant?" No response. She tried professors at major universities. The few who replied were polite but dismissive. "You're connecting unrelated anomalies into a pattern that doesn't exist. Human history is well documented. Your theory contradicts established knowledge." "What about the buildings?" Sarah pressed. "Why are government buildings from that period consistently oversized? Victorian architectural preferences. Well-established historical fact. But why would they choose proportions that made buildings more expensive and less functional for normal-sized people?" No one had an answer. Or rather, no one wanted to engage with the question. Sarah expanded her investigation beyond furniture and buildings. She started looking for tools. An estate sale in Maine advertised antique industrial equipment. Sarah drove up and found wrenches. Massive wrenches. 5 feet long, weighing over 100 pounds each. Designed for hands much larger than hers. The seller shrugged when she asked about them. "Came from an old factory built in the 1880s. I assume they're for some kind of heavy machinery." "What kind of machinery?" "No idea. The factory was demolished in 1950. These were in storage." Sarah bought 3 wrenches. Back home she tried to use one. She could barely lift it. Operating it would require hands twice the size of hers and strength far beyond normal human capability. She found similar tools in other estate sales. Hammers with handles 4 feet long. Pliers that required 2 hands to grip the handles. Not decorative. Not ceremonial. Functional tools showing wear patterns from decades of use. Museums had some in their collections, usually labeled industrial equipment, purpose unknown. But industrial equipment serves specific purposes. These tools didn't match any known industrial process from the 1800s, unless the people using them were much larger than normal. Sarah photographed the tools next to standard-sized equivalents. The proportional scaling was exact. If you designed tools for someone 9 feet tall with proportionally larger hands and greater strength, you'd create exactly what she was finding. More evidence. More confirmation of a pattern everyone refused to acknowledge. Sarah tracked down the locations mentioned in old newspaper reports. Places where giant skeletons had been discovered in the 1880s and 1890s. A mound in Ohio, a burial site in Wisconsin, a construction excavation in Pennsylvania. Most sites had been built over. Housing developments, shopping centers, roads. But a few remained accessible. Sarah hired a ground-penetrating radar specialist. "I'm looking for unusual burial formations," she told him. "Possibly larger than standard." They scanned the Ohio site. The readings showed organized structures underground, chambers, arranged in rows, larger than typical burial plots. "Someone's buried here," the specialist confirmed. "Multiple individuals. The chambers are big though, maybe family crypts." "Can you determine how big?" He checked his readings. 8 feet. By 4 feet, maybe larger. That's unusual for the period. Most graves from the 1800s are smaller. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "Can we excavate?" "You'd need permits, historical site permissions. Probably take months." Sarah applied for permits. The State Historical Society denied them. Insufficient justification for disturbing potentially sacred burial grounds. "Your research doesn't meet academic standards for archaeological investigation." She tried other sites. Same result. Every application denied. The reasons were always bureaucratic, always reasonable sounding. But the pattern was clear. She could measure buildings. She could buy furniture and tools. But she couldn't touch the burial sites. Couldn't access the one type of evidence that would be irrefutable. The skeletons were off limits. Sarah organized everything she'd found. Photographs, measurements, newspaper clippings, architectural plans, tools, furniture specifications. She created a comprehensive database cross-referencing dates, locations, and physical evidence. The pattern was undeniable. Between 1850 and 1900, humans of extraordinary size existed in sufficient numbers to be regularly photographed, regularly employed in official positions, and regularly discovered in burial sites after death. They worked in government buildings designed to accommodate their proportions. They used tools scaled to their size. They were documented in newspapers without sensationalism or disbelief. Then, around 1900, everything stopped. The photographs ceased. The newspaper reports ended. The discoveries were lost. The historical record was cleaned. Sarah tried to present her findings at academic conferences. Her proposals were rejected. She tried to publish in peer-reviewed journals. The papers were returned without review. She contacted documentary filmmakers, journalists, history podcasts. Most didn't respond. The few who did called her research interesting but fringe. No one would engage with the evidence directly. They just dismissed it as conspiracy theory without examining what she'd actually found. Then, between 1890 and 1920, they disappeared from the historical record. Not because they stopped existing, but because someone decided to erase them. The skeletons were collected and lost. The photographs were filed and forgotten. The buildings were renovated, and their original purpose obscured. The newspaper reports stopped. The encyclopedias were rewritten. The maps were redrawn. Systematic erasure across multiple institutions and countries. Coordinated silence maintained for over a century. Why? I don't know. But the effort required to hide this suggests something significant. Something someone thought was too dangerous to acknowledge. The buildings remember even if we don't. The photographs preserve what the textbooks deleted. The evidence persists. And now you know. Sarah hit publish. The questions wouldn't die. The evidence wouldn't disappear. People would keep finding oversized furniture, measuring old buildings, discovering photographs in forgotten archives. The giants had been erased from official history, but they'd left traces, physical evidence that couldn't be fully destroyed. And as long as someone was willing to ask why buildings from the 1800s had 15-foot doors, why tools weighed hundreds of pounds, why photographs showed impossible people in positions of authority, the truth would persist. Denied, dismissed, mocked, but persistent. Sarah closed her laptop. She'd done what she could. Preserved the evidence, asked the questions, shown the pattern. Whether anyone listened was up to them. But the giants had existed. The guardians of Tartaria were real, and nothing the mainstream institutions said would erase that truth.